This slide is a very brief review of Chapter 21. Please use the given information for number 1 to determine what the genotypic frequencies are. And from that information, are you able to figure out the allele or allelic frequencies? After you've done that, I wanted to briefly go over number 2. I wasn't able to get to it in my Chapter 21 notes. There's 3 types of natural selection: directional, stabilizing, or disruptive. And these are all going to be scenarios in which certain members of a population are favored based on the traits that they have in their environment. So when you have directional selection, that is when one of the extremes in a population is favored. So if we're talking about, let's say, mouse fur, white versus dark fur, just the dark fur could be favored. So that means that natural selection would work in a directional sense towards that dark fur. And it could be the opposite, just white fur. The other type is stabilizing, and that is when the intermediate or in-between phenotypes are being favored. So again, if we're looking at mouse fur and we have like white versus dark, the mice that have the in-between color, so whether it's a gray or a tan, those are going to be favored with stabilizing. And then finally, disruptive selection. If we have, again, all the different colors of mouse fur, those in which are at both extremes will be favored. So white fur is favored, and also the very dark fur would be favored. Now that I gave an example using mouse fur and the different types of selection, utilize the ideas that I just said and apply it to the scenarios at the bottom. So letter A, B, C, and D. Each of those are types of natural selection. See if you can figure out, based on what I just said, which is which.
Chapter 22, The Origin of Species.
Chapter 22 is about the origin of species, which is speciation. So what speciation is, even though it says origin of species here, it's when one species splits into 2 or more groups. And that's something that we saw with phylogeny and the phylogenetic trees and the cladograms. We had an original ancestor and it split off because of natural selection. So there's 2 ways of looking at speciation, and again, that branching off on a micro scale versus a macro scale. So microevolution is when we focus on those allele frequencies within a single gene pool. So again, going back to the homozygous, dominant, and recessive, and that heterozygous. That would be, looking at that information would be microevolution. Macroevolution is the evolutionary change above looking at a species. So these are going to be the cumulative effects of speciation, the branching off, over long periods of time. Please watch this video. It shows how species can become reproductively isolated from one another. I haven't been able to figure out a good way to embed the link or figure out how to get you the link. So the link is here. You have to jot it down, and please watch it. Since we now know what speciation is, when you have one species that splits into 2 or more over time, what exactly is the definition of a species? So the biological species concept defines species as a population or a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature, and they have to produce viable, fertile offspring. So living and fertile means that they're able to reproduce as well. They have to be reproductively compatible. Now, sometimes you have a species where they are no longer able to reproduce, so they are reproductively isolated. So reproductive isolation is some type of a barrier that prevents members of two species from producing viable, fertile hybrids. So these are things that can take place over time, as hopefully you saw in the video clip that was just a couple minutes long. And there's going to be some barriers that we're going to talk about in just a moment that prevents species that are similar from reproducing with one another. There are many barriers in place which prevent different kinds of species, even if they're close, from reproducing with one another. The two main types are prezygotic barriers versus postzygotic barriers. Prezygotic means before the zygote. So egg and sperm meet. When the egg is fertilized, it's then called a zygote. So this would be, the prezygotic would be preventing fertilization from occurring, so before that even takes place. Again, these are ways that species are not able to reproduce with one another. So now, types of prezygotic barriers. The first is habitat isolation. So organisms, they might be close to one another, but there's nothing physically preventing them from actually seeing each other. They just don't, for whatever reason. Another type of prezygotic barrier is temporal isolation. And this is when you have species that are in the same area. They may mate or try to reproduce at different times of the day, different times of the year, different seasons. So for that reason, they're not going to have that chance to try to reproduce with one another. Another type is behavioral isolation, and different kinds of organisms have different mating techniques, whether it's like a bird call, a bird song. Some animals do kind of weird dances and stuff like that. Organisms that are behavior isolated, they don't have the same courtship, the same mating behaviors, so they wouldn't end up mating with one another. Another type of prezygotic barrier is mechanical isolation, and this is going to be where there is an actual mating attempt, but it just physically doesn't work out. So one of the examples is snails, which I didn't know. Please read on page 436, and actually there's examples on page 436 of all of these that I'm going over. So you can read about the snails on 436. Another type of prezygotic barrier is gametic isolation. And this is where there actually is mating again, but there is no fertilization that takes place. So those are all barriers preventing reproduction before the zygote, so no zygote. The other type of reproductive barrier, again, is post-zygotic barrier. And this is where there is going to be a zygote. But when we have different species, you don't want there to be viable offspring necessarily. So in this case, the zygote is sometimes prevented from actually developing into a fertile adult. So there's going to be 3 different types of post-zygotic barriers. So there has been mating and fertilization. The first type is reduced hybrid viability, and in this case, the offspring does not fully develop. And viable, if it's not viable, that means it ends up dying, the offspring, within its development before it sometimes is even born. A second type of post-zygotic barrier is reduced hybrid fertility. So now we have offspring, but in this case, the offspring often are not fertile. So they're sterile, so they can't have offspring or children. And the last type is hybrid breakdown. So we have offspring from two different species, and the first set of offspring seem okay. They are not sterile, they're fertile, but when they go to have children, those children are often small, sometimes not viable, or not fertile. So it's like the second generation from the cross has a breakdown in its genes, basically. Okay, so I didn't really go into many examples other than the snail, which I found to be odd and interesting. Please read again on page 436 for examples of all of these. Some of them are interesting. So I decided to insert the diagram or picture from 436 onto a slide. So here it is. I'm not explaining it, but please make sure you're able to identify the picture with what type of reproductive barrier, and more specifically, what example, whether it's pre-zygotic or post-zygotic, in all the different examples that I gave on the last slide. Biological species concept really emphasizes differences that organisms have due to those reproductive barriers. But there are other definitions of species. One of them is the morphological species concept, and this is where the species is defined in described by having similar body shapes, similar sizes, and also any other structures or features that they would have in common. Another way to define species is its ecological role in the community, its niche or niche. How does it live with its other living organisms in an area? How does it survive with the non-living parts of its area or community? And the third is phylogenetic species concept. And this is where, again, organisms that share a common ancestor form one branch on the tree of life. So we'd put them on one branch, and that would be an indicator that they're one species.